Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all in our inaugural session of our seminar of Hillary term. It's so nice to see so many old friends of the seminar, so many good colleagues across the Atlantic. Welcome you all to our seminar, and we are very pleased to be launching, as it were, today Margarita's book. Before I introduce our guest speakers today, I just want to say a very brief word about the seminar for those of you who are joining us for the first time. This seminar was launched back in October 2013, and since then we've been meeting every Thursday of the term throughout the academic year. So many good friends that have gone through the seminar are here with us today. I'm very pleased to see them, and thank you all for continue coming and attending the seminar. Since the pandemic, we moved to Zoom, and that has been a great one of the few things coming out of this crisis. And at the same time, we introduced this format, La Tertulia, where we discuss on an informal basis books that have been recently published. And it's, of course, a great pleasure and honor to be discussing Margarita's book, at which I understand is the first time it's been discussed in the seminar. So it's a great privilege for us. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back Margarita to the Latin American Center, this time in Zoom. Margarita is a faculty member at Sarah Lawrence College. She received her PhD from Princeton University, and I'm glad to see Jeremy Edelman here today. Welcome, Jeremy. Before she studied history and economics at the Universidad de los Andes, and I have seen some good colleagues from the Andes also here in the room. I saw Jimena, so I welcome Jimena here. And we are here today precisely to discuss, to talk about Margarita's new book, The World That Latin America Created, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America in the Development Era. She has published in other prestigious outlets like the Latin American Social Review, and in a series of edited volumes about the development state in Latin America, the Cold War social science, and the global social sciences. Many thanks, Margarita, and welcome to our seminar. To discuss her book today, we have Andrés Guiot-Isaac, who is a doctoral student at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. He is a bursary of ICETEX program Pasaporte a la Ciencia, and holder of an Oxford Global History of Capitalism project studentship. Andrés' thesis deals very much with some of the subjects that we are discussing today. He's basically working on the history of technocracy in Colombia, looking at the economics profession in the 1970s. He has published in a few journals and chapters books, but he also translated into Spanish Jeremy Edelman's biography of Albert Hirschman, or the philosopher, The Odyssey of Albert Hirschman. So it's very, I think, an appropriate person to discuss the book with Margarita. So without further ado, Andrés and Margarita, the floor is yours. Welcome to our seminar, and many thanks for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to Andrés for agreeing to host and co-host this seminar. I'm very happy and a little bit, nervous, I must say.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for the introduction, and it is a real privilege to me to be discussing Margarita's coming book. I just learned I might be one of its first readers. So again, the honor is mine, Margarita. Let's begin this discussion, and let me begin by asking about the main theme and argument of your book, because at first glimpse it would seem it's a book about CEPAL, the United Nations Commission for Latin America, and the people involved in the institution during what you call the development era. But it's much more than that. It's about the world they imagined, the world they conceived, and as you argue, the world they even create from Latin America. So what was precisely the word that Latin America created, and what was the role of CEPAL in this creation, this imagination, and how did the idea of this book come about? Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So in the first decades of the after the Second World War, Latin American economists and policy makers created what I would call a worldview. Categories to describe the world economy, such as center, periphery, and dependency. And they also created the corresponding tools in terms of development policies and national, regional, and global political projects to transform a world that they consider highly unequal. So the world that Latin America created kind of talks about those different levels, like the intellectual level and both the political projects that they created to transform a world that they saw as unequal. And so the book is about this sort of when, how, and why do these categories emerge, and what is the impact that they had in Latin America and in the rest of the world as well. As you said, like the UN CEPAL is, or like and this I must say, like I chose to, I guess as many people have done recently, to use CEPAL in Spanish rather than the ECLA that was used in the literature of the 90s, let's say, and even the early 2000s. So I'm using the word CEPAL and CEPALinos to define these intellectuals and policymakers, as opposed to other different words that we could use. But so the UN CEPAL was crucial for the story for several reasons. So one, it brought together a cohort of economists, and this we can talk about more about, just to say it loosely for now, from across the region, but mainly from Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And it provided the mechanisms to communicate and circulate their ideas. So it was also crucial, I think, because the UN CEPAL, I'm going to just say it like that, had a mandate to study the region in the world. And I think that was also crucial for me, that like in a way, sometimes we think about like the CEPALino project beginning with Prevish. And I wanted to trace before Prevish sort of what's there in the institutional fabric of CEPAL and see what was there sort of embedded in the institution before there's sort of ideas sort of took hold there. So it had this mandate to study the region in the world, and therefore, in a way, it provided leverage and resources, many types of resources, financial, but also like institutional and political, to catapult these ideas that had emerged before the foundation of CEPAL, like ideas such as center and periphery, but had been constricted into very specific circles. And so it provided a mechanism to kind of, I don't know, transmit them, I guess, to other contexts and other levels. And I think finally it was also very crucial to, because CEPAL occupied, and that's what has always been fascinating to me about this institution, that it has this very particular, like ambiguous state in many ways. And this I have had a lot of pushback in the terms that I've presented, or the times that I was developing the book. It was like, is CEPAL a global institution? Why? And for some people, it was just it's a regional institution. And I guess what I was trying to kind of prove throughout the text was that it was a global institution. But to me, it's crucial because it has this ambivalent way. It's both a regional body and a global institution, and it goes, I guess, with two ideologies, if to call it that way, of the post-war era, like sort of internationalism and a nationalism. So to me, that's what's making CEPAL a very kind of rich institution, and hence why it allowed for these ideas to kind of take hold and transcend. I'm going to leave it that way, but I can also, I don't know if you want me to answer the sort of why did I come up with the idea of this book. And I guess it will take me back to grad school and my first, seminar or something that I was trying to read, doing an economic history historiography paper, let's say, and I was really struck by two observations, I guess. One, that it seemed to be that CEPAL was everywhere in the economic history textbooks, and it was like, well, this was crucial for the import substitution and like industrialization, and it provided the foundation and this and this and this and that. So it was everywhere, and at the same time, there was nothing to kind of explain to us like how was it crucial. And on the other hand, we had this narrative of like, okay, there are the powerful economists are not them, even though they're really crucial. The powerful economists are the Chicago boys and the monetarists and these the neoliberals. Those are the very powerful economists. So I wanted to kind of reconcile these two things. How can they be so crucial and yet kind of powerless? So I think that's this is me trying to remember back to the seminar. I'm sure that was not the way I thought about it in the very beginning, but this is how it sort of this is how I think about that foundational moment for me, I guess, if you want.
Thank you, Margarita. There are so many things from your response that I would like to touch upon later today. For instance, this kind of tension between being both a regional and a global institution, and the sense how this made this created conflicts between CEPAL and other institutions. I'll ask you something about that later, but let me begin with something you mentioned, which is this idea of understanding CEPAL and CEPALinos beyond privilege and before privilege. So this brings me to the following question: who are the CEPALinos? Because it has quite it covers from your book a heterogeneous group that includes, you mentioned economists, but also diplomats. And you see people coming in and out of the group, like Roberto Campos, for example, in the 1950s, the Brazilian economic diplomat. And even the position of privilege within the group was not necessarily, a position of strength throughout the whole period. So who are the CEPALinos, and what brought these men together, and women? And women, I insist this, of course, because there are some women also in your book that you touched upon. What brought these men and women together under the same umbrella? And how did you grapple with the diversity of ideas and positions within the group?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it is also something that I sort of struggle with at the beginning. When I started writing about it, I would just write the economists did this, economists did that. And then, but as I struggled to sort of saying like, well, how can I characterize these actors? And, and I run into like, or I try to use other categories such as, technocrats, or like maybe like thinking about Rebecca, like money doctors, or like are they public intellectuals, or are they policymakers, or diplomats, as they say. So it was very hard to sort of pinpoint or to select a word. So that's why I just ended up using the institutional description, because as you said, it was sort of many diverse kind of actors that were joined together at different times, and so what joined them together was the institution. So that's why I sort of chose the institutional affiliation as the definition. I think that, but beyond that a little bit, what I wanted to also show, I think a lot of these CEPALinos had, or all of them, kind of shared or came to share belief, or it's just a belief is sort of weird, but an understanding of the world as of the world and the world economy as an unequal division of labor between the industrial centers and the raw material producing peripheries, that at least initially, many of them believe that both industrialization, like import substitution industrialization, but industrialization and the cooperation between those centers and the peripheries was going to transform that world system, let's say. So I think that those are the two things that define them. So one is sort of the institutional affiliation, either that, as you say, comes and goes, like it's not static over time, and even the self-identification. I think some of them would sometimes call themselves and ally themselves with the institutions, and sometimes they pull away, depending on the context, on the political and economic context. So those are the two, and the sort of the kind of understanding of the world in those two levels. I think, and I think that is the same. The fact that they're brought together by this shared understanding of how the world economy works was what brought them together, but also what brought them apart. Because the center periphery perspective is very, in a way, is very rich and very malleable. Let's say it's kind of flexible, and it can be used for different political, and it was used for many different political projects. So so that's what was at the heart, I think, of the diversity in ideology and in the politics of each of these cepalinos, and how it unfolded over time from the, like the late 1940s when they come together, to the late 1970s, let's say. I'm gonna stop there a bit. But I should talk about also, what you said sometimes about Prevish and the other cepalinos coming and going apart, but I'll leave it there.
Sure, I'm sure we'll have time to cover these figures in the coming questions. And I think something you do brilliantly is precisely showing how this kind of both the affiliation, the institutional element of affiliation to CEPAL, and this theoretical understanding of unequal exchange and how to address unequal exchange kind of draws an arch between these early cepalinos and what you later call the dependentistas. And it's with the dependentistas that this tension becomes more explicit. But something that your book shows very well is how this tension was there from the very onset, from the beginning. But coming back to the CEPAL as an institution, and the contributions that came from this institution in the 1950s, there's, as you acknowledge in your book, there are plenty of previous studies about CEPAL and cepalinos, mainly by followers and disciples who attempted to systematize, consolidate these concepts that were spread in several types of documents, in institutional reports, published articles, etc. And there are also several memories that the book draws upon, and recent biographies of the main participants. And you argue that your book does something different from these previous studies. I quote that it recovers the story of cepalinos themselves, not just their ideas, from the outside in. So I wanted to ask you, what does this approach from the outside in add, and what we know from previous writings about CEPAL as an institution and cepalinos?
Yeah, thanks. That's always like sort of one of the kind of harder questions, because there's in many ways lots of work being done, and so lots of work that I used to write this text. So I don't want to. It's always hard to sort of like, yeah, I used it so much that I don't want to tell, like, what do I do, sort of, better or more or something. But what I was trying to do was trying to get at their story beyond, not a story of their ideas, but a story of them, of the cepalinos. And so what I was trying to do, I guess, I think when I was trying to use from the expression, I guess, from the outside in, had to do with the type of sources I had to use also, or that I was able to use to get at the story of cepalinos. So for instance, I found the IMF archive as a very rich source to tell me a lot about the debates that were happening with cepalinos themselves. Like, I could get through them. And so that's, in a way, what I was sort of thinking, like methodologically, I was sort of thinking, okay, I'm sort of doing it from the outside in. Just to say something, but I also, in terms of the contributions, I think I wanted to talk about, I wanted to show, well, different things, sort of by looking them as historical actors and looking at them and not their ideas. I wanted to show that they were like sort of explore the politics of their expertise. Like, what are they doing? What are they doing in the world, sort of? How are they engaging with the world around them? And that's what I was trying to recover, their sort of political projects and their involvement. And I ended up, and that this is what kind of the book shows, like kind of their involvement with kind of the most important political projects of their day. So, and by doing that, I think I was able to show that the diversity between that it's within the group of Cepalinos and Dependentistas, but not just to show like, you know, like, oh yes, this is what more complex than, you know, what we thought it was or something, but because I think that diversity generated changes over the project over time, like not just from the Cepalinos to the Dependentistas in a way, although that is an important one, sort of like a kind of middle point in the story kind of thing, but also within the Cepalino project itself, like how the diversity allowed it to transform over time more than we normally think, I guess. Yeah, I think that was kind of my goal by doing that.
Thank you, Margarita. Yeah, and I did learn from your book that it is true that there are no CEPAL archives for the 1950s. And perhaps, yeah, we can talk later about that. So you had to use other sources, and you mentioned just the sources from the IMF, which brings me to a question I had for you, related to the place that CEPAL as an institution had in the international global order of the post-war period. And I found extremely interesting how your sources lay open the clashes during the 1950s between Cepalinos in Santiago and the staff in multilateral institutions in cities like Washington and New York. For example, with the people from the UN headquarters. I think this is, I mean, your book is the one which this tension between CEPAL as a UN agency in Santiago and the UN quarters in New York come to the fore. But also there were some clashes between CEPAL and the OAS, and notably the clash in the late 1950s, mostly between CEPAL and the International Monetary Fund, and this sort of debate around the causes of inflation, structural causes of inflation and monetarists, but what came to be known as such, you know. And it reads as if CEPAL was in a constant battle to define its place and purpose in a moment in which these jurisdictions and the jurisdictions of these institutions had not been clearly defined or specified in the ground, and that's how actors perceive them. That's incredible how you show that in your book. So again, I come back to my question, which is what place did CEPAL occupy in this institutional arrangement, and how did this place change across the period?
Well, I'm sort of very glad that came across because that's one of the sort of crucial questions that I wanted to bring about with the book by focusing on CEPAL. Like, you know, the book is centered on CEPAL, but it does show the relationship with the institution with other institutions. And the point of showing those relationships was that showing the sort of the kind of fragility and the in construction character of the post-war order, let's say, in the like it was laid out with these institutions, but it was still sort of like a blueprint. And so how it evolved over time. And I think, so that is one important point. And the other is to say that those institutions are sort of building, how do you call it? Like they're building each other, like, or it's in their relations with each other that they're building their own sphere of influence, and that they're building their own capacity to act and influence in the rest of I mean, in the different regions of the world. I mean, in this case, in Latin America, but I'm sure maybe we could find something similar for other regions. So I think that is one of the most important points of the book, is sort of showing the world order in construction, let's say, as is being fought over by institutions or by the staff in these institutions who are trying to assert their authority. I think it's also kind of, I try to show also how CEPAL sort of became how in this sort of battle over which is the territory of each particular institution, I try to show that, for instance, CEPAL appropriated a problem that was going around all of the international organizations and became sort of the bearer of the problem of international trade and development. Every institution was sort of talking about it, but it was in CEPAL that it became like, okay, this is the signature characteristic of this institution we're talking about. And to me, this was very salient because it was precisely the point at what the International Trade Organization sort of collapsed. That's when the International Trade Organization sort of, or not even collapsed, but was unborn, let's say. That was the moment when sort of CEPAL emerged to kind of take that, to fill that hole, let's say, fill that vacuum. So that's sort of one of the, just to show an example of how this sort of struggle sort of happens and CEPAL ends up embodying a particular kind of project. And I think, what else can I tell you a little bit about the post-war order? I think kind of in more general terms, the book is also part of a wider trend that is trying to show how the economic institutions of the Global South shape the international governance in sort of perhaps ways, not the obvious ways, but in many important ways. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at those two things.
Thanks, Margarita. And it makes me think about something that you elaborate later in your book, which is, of course, the previous participation in the UNCTAD and of course, the failed attempt to build this new international economic order in the 1970s. There is certainly, it is interesting, and we'll talk much. I want to ask you later about that, how kind of the fact that CEPAL appropriated it's the position around this problem of international trade and unequal exchange allowed these people to have a global audience later on, or you put it in terms of Latin Americanizing wider debates, which I found a very interesting expression. But in connection to my previous question and coming back to the IMF, so something that I found really interesting is that although, I mean, this CEPAL was constantly fighting and trying to have a space in this international order, your book argues that CEPALinos achieved, to a certain degree, a hegemony in the battle of ideas about economic development in Latin America. So, in a way, you suggest that they were in a position of strength. And this was particularly clear in the discussion around the debate between structuralism and monetarism, in which, again, you sustained that CEPALinos were rather at the offensive, and that positions that we would later associate with neoliberalism, of course, this is a retrospective use of the term, were the defensive. So can you elaborate more on this idea and something kind of you kind of suggest in the introduction, which is that understanding the 1950s and these debates allow us also to kind of rethink and retell the story about neoliberalism and its triumph in the region and in later decades.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, all your questions are so rich that I sometimes like there's so many pieces that I could take. So yes, so especially in the relationship with the CEPAL and the IMF, which is the one that I explore more thoroughly through the text, or rather the one that I follow more consistently through the book. But it's true of other examples that I show with the Chicago boys and other sort of schools of economics that are kind of emerging in Chile. What I try to show when I try to, or I guess, and it brings me back to something that I said in the very beginning of the talk of like, why write a book of CEPAL, or what brought me to this research project in the beginning, has to do with the way we see who has influence and who has power at certain moments of time. So what I wanted what I show in the book is that many of those intellectual movements and institutions that appear to have triumphed by the end of the 20th century, and therefore have this aura of like always always, or of always been having been so powerful, were not always that, or at least it didn't seem to the actors themselves, you know, to those members of those institutions. So to me, it was not like a coincidence, or it's not a coincidence that, for instance, the Chicago Boys sort of emerged at in Santiago de Chile, in the kind of headquarters of CEPAL, of the institution. It was an attempt to sort of subvert an influence that they saw kind of as I mean, dangerous is a little bit like conspiratorial term, but that they saw as threatening. It's a better word kind of to use. So that's sort of what I was trying to use when I say it's and in the defensive. Like in many ways, we CEPAL, what I was trying to say, like CEPAL we might think about as like, you know, the kind of, if we think of these as David and Goliath stories, I sort of wanted to say like, well, maybe the David was not as David, you know, like the Cepalinos had influence and were at many points, and I guess that's what I show in the book, are many points setting the terms of the debate and setting the agenda that others were responding to, you know, proposing certain things and then getting pushback, and rather than defending a sort of a territory that go narrower and narrower and narrower. So I think I sort of change sort of the scope of that and see the funnel going in the other direction. And I wish we could talk about, maybe we can talk more about it later, of more specific episodes in which this is shown with more like tangible evidence. But just to mention one, as Andrés was mentioning before, there's the struggle between what become the structuralists and monetarists by the 1960s, which is begins in the early 1950s, but it consolidates as a debate between the structuralists and monetarists in the 1960s. So at the peak of this debate in the early 1960s, there's a large exchange of correspondence within the IMF staff of how to respond to Cepalinos, and say like how to, in a way, it's to me, was very surprising and in many ways very entertaining to read the extent to which the amount of time devoted to saying like, well, but what can we do? What can we do about this? Why are we not being misunderstood in Latin America? Basically, why does everybody hate us? And why do people kind of agree with Cepalinos? And like, I mean, I'm a little bit caricaturizing this, but that's the sort of gist of it. And at the very end, they said like, well, maybe we haven't done enough to promote our ideas. So in the sense, they feel like, or they understand, they feel that they lost, not because they were just fighting with ideas. They lost because they hadn't fought with ideas, I guess, is the reason, which to me was surprising, because we normally think that the IMF sort of prevails because they have the financial leverage. And to me, it was interesting to see like, well, maybe they thought that they were not prevailing because they were not fighting the battle of ideas, and instead they were fighting the battle with financial leverage. So I'm going to leave it at that, although that's, you know, as you can see, what it's more fascinating to me, so I could talk about it endlessly. But
that's such an interesting thought, Margarita, and it is really amusing also to read from this book sort of both the frustration and the strategizing of IMF staff. That really kind of reveals what you were saying, that they were at the defensive, and it created perhaps a stimulating a environment and some sort of self-reflection within the institution. I think it's evidence of the sort of hegemony you attribute to CEPAL, at least in Latin America. And I'm glad you brought back the notion of ideas, and the fact that ideas matter. And I want to ask you about the core idea of Cepalinos, which kind of allows you to build this arch between Cepalinos and Dependentistas. And it's this idea of framework of center periphery, which of course was re-elaborated and appropriated by a variety of actors in response to the changing political economy of the region. Of course, from democracy to authoritarianism in the 1960s, and with foreign exchange constraints also becoming tougher and tougher as the decade went on. And I found it interesting how this framework allows Cepalinos to intervene in very different environments. For example, the intervention in post-revolutionary Cuba was something I was unaware about. And it was happening almost simultaneously as Previch and others were kind of being behind the counter-revolution, which was the Alliance for Progress. So can you tell us more about kind of these various interventions that this framework allowed for in the 1950s, and perhaps how it became, or it seems as your book advances, that it became more the remain of the radical academic and political projects, particularly when the Dependentistas took this framework and made it their own. How do you understand this kind of shift in the way in which the framework was used, appropriated, and reappropriated?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that sometimes we, and I remember talking to like one of my mentors in Princeton as well about this kind of idea of the acceleration of time in the sort of end of the 1950s and early sort of 60s. Like a lot of things are started happening at the same time, and so and that's exactly what you're referring to with your questions. There's this moment in like the sort of early 50s and late 50s and early 1960s that there is kind of like a bifurcation, or more than a bifurcation, like a multiplication of paths that Cepalinos take while using the center periphery framework. So one of the big bifurcations I trace in the book was how some sort of allied or began working with revolutionary Cuba, like with Castro and Che Guevara, and how others sort of took the Alliance for Progress to be what was going to embody their ideas. So to us, it seemed to me very telling of the flexibility of the framework, but also of this sort of acceleration of time, of the possibilities that it allowed in the moment to kind of be able to see Cepalinos working almost simultaneously in two projects that we, at least kind of in the historiography, are almost conceiving as opposite politically, at least. And so I think that and as you say, like it's precisely also in this moment that some people like some groups, like which later are going to become like the Dependentistas, kind of adopt the center periphery framework and take it to produce the notion of dependency, to kind of think about what of the relationship between development and dependency. And I think that at the moment, sometimes we think that, like that the Cuban Revolution has this radicalizing effect in the intellectual world, and that's how things, or that's why, things change in terms of ideas in Latin America. And just we just to think about the Latin American boom, or like that is this radicalization that the Cuban Revolution causes that creates a different sort of intellectual coordinates. But what I was thinking with CEPAL, or what CEPAL allows us to kind of reframe that that narrative, is that at this moment, and it has to do with the Cuban Revolution as well, but also with the Alliance for Progress, as I was saying, is that at this moment, it's not that sometimes the center periphery framework goes sort of left with the Dependentistas, but maybe for them, the Cepalinos went right with their with the position that CEPAL as an institution took in relation to Cuba after 1960, or because it wasn't even in 59, but after 1960, and that it had with the Alliance for Progress. So I think that was like a turning point. Let's say that's a turning point in the story. I'm not sure I'm completely answering your question there, but I hope that.
No, Margarita, that's perfect, and I'm sure if there are follow-up questions, they will turn out in the Q&A. Now, I mean, we've talked almost all of the time about Cepalinos, but half of your book is about dependentistas and dependency theory, and I would like to ask you about them. And something I found interesting is that, I mean, while the discussion of Cepalinos, while the space of the discussion, the space of debate, Cepalinos were mostly the policy arena and multilateral institutions. When your book gets to dependentistas, we have a glimpse of academic institutions and centers in key cities like Brasilia and the School of Brasilia, where Gunder Frank, Teotonio dos Santos, Rui Mauro Marini were, the Sao Paulo and the Sociology School in Sao Paulo, where Cardoso studied and became a professor, and of course Santiago with his, in your words, pluralist environment. I would like to ask you more about sort of the academic institutions that allowed for the emergence of the project of dependency theory, and how kind of these institutions, kind of this, what you call the pluralism in these institutions made and allowed for the emergence of the dependency theory.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's true. I hadn't thought about that, but like it's that half the book is kind of about international governance, and then the other half really switches to the kind of social sciences in many ways. Yeah. But so yeah, so what I tried to show is, well, first in that second part of the book is like the extent to which dependency theory was sort of in kind of or like dependency ideas emerge in Chile, but are actually they become dependency theory in Santiago. And what I mean by that, by becoming dependency theory in Santiago, is that, and then I'll connect it back to your question about the academic centers in Santiago, is that, so what I mean by that dependency theory becomes dependency theory in Santiago, is that, well, that's first, like, and I think most of us here know, like that's where like the Brazilian exiles sort of found refuge in Santiago. But Santiago was able to, and so that in a way made it look like it brought all of them and made it seem like this was like a consensus sort of like emerging in Santiago and radiating out from Santiago to like the rest of Latin America as one consolidated theory, even though what is happening is like a fracture of all the different versions and projects that emerge from dependency theory. So what Santiago does, in my view, is that it has, because the social sciences are sort of like, the professionalization of the social sciences is sort of like undergoing at this moment. The consolidation of dependency theory and the professionalization of sociology, in this case, sort of kind of go hand in hand, and we can use one to explain explain the other, and sort of vice versa. So the dependentistas found a very rich and growing institutional environment to which they could create different affiliations. So I mean, this is a little bit of like kind of like, in the word of economists, like a stylized fact that I sort of trace or plot the each of the individual dependentistas to a particular academic center. Not, this is obviously like, as the economists do, a stylized fact doesn't doesn't much properly, but it still can allow us to think about how the different institutions allow each of the different versions of dependency to have an institutional stronghold, and to and to move the dynamic, to kind of create a dynamism that was not and a fracture that was not there before. So Santiago both sort of consolidated the theory by bringing together all these Brazilian dependentistas in conversation with the Cepalinos that were still in Santiago, and then fractured it along the lines of the political sphere in Chile, which was, as we know, very polarized at the time, in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Thank you, Margarita. I think, and Eduardo, correct me if I'm wrong, we still have time for one or two more questions if we keep them brief.
Sorry.
No. I'm talking about me keeping the questions brief, but you, of course, your answers have been perfect so far. So I'll just kind of touch upon what you mentioned in your last response, which is the centrality of Santiago and previously of cities in Brazil, because the title of your book is The Word Latin America Created. But the battle of ideas that you trace took place at very concrete time, of course, and places, and mostly in Brazil and Chile, and of course, to a lesser extent, Cuba. So I wanted to ask you to what extent these concrete experiences that Cepalinos and afterwards dependentistas had in this country shaped the world that Latin America created. And I guess kind of for someone who studies Colombia, this is a pertinent question. And some books have been written about the absence of Cepal's influence in places like Colombia. And I remember once talking with Jose Antonio Campo, he told me that that in a way kind of the word of Cepalinos was created having Brazil and Chile and Brazil and the southern corner in mind. So to what extent the Brazil and Chile and their experience there shaped these concrete experiences of Cepalinos and dependentistas, and therefore the world they created?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think that's one of and I think in the book is both, which probably is not correct scientific method, but is both an assumption and sort of an argument of the book, which very probably not convenient, but I do try to have both that as a starting point, but also show it, like kind of prove how much the Brazilian and the Chilean experience sort of transform the project of Cepalinos. And to do that, I sort of a lot of it, and there's like this happens, for instance, in the debate about structuralism and monetarism, in which the transition of ideas from Chile to Brazil in this case. So in Chile, the ideas of that's when Cepalinos started discussing what are the causes of inflation and what is the best way to deal with inflation. It's related to the Chilean case, but and it's true that other sort of Brazilians are sort of thinking about that that issues as well. But it's the Chilean case that becomes sort of foundational for what later would become like the structural approach to inflation, or what I call like the Cepalino approach to inflation. And but the sort of connotation, the political connotation and the political implications of that theory sort of kind of emerged as the ideas migrated from Chile to Brazil. So in a way, that's what I was sort of suggesting. Like I both sort of assumed that is the case, and I think many of I think it was also very clear from for the Cepalinos at some point, and for their critics, the extent to which Brazil and Chile were shaping the idea that they were creating for Latin America, like how Mexico wasn't kind of as prominent, and how and not to say, I mean, not to even mention the rest of the region. So I try to use some of the examples to show the extent to which Brazil and Chile were foundational, but I think also that there is so much work that I wish I could have done to sort of also explore how other countries, if not necessarily shaping those Cepalino core ideas, were at least receiving them and transforming them into their specific national context. And I think we, Andres, like that we sort of talked about how to do this for the case of Colombia, and like thinking about what was the reception of Cepalino ideas in Colombia that says like that it's not let's say like the end of the story is not to say like there was no influence at all. That was not the case, but it was a different kind that we can see in Chile and Brazil. And I guess it had to do because the core Cepalinos are Chileans and Brazilians, and they were very much involved in the politics of their time. So that also kind of amplifies the effect of these two countries in the project of Cepalinos and of Cepalinos in these two particular countries.
Well, thank you, Margarita. This has been wonderful so far, and I have tons of questions, and we'll of course continue the conversation later, but I think it's about time to open the floor for the Q&A. I remind you that you can either ask the question in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll perhaps give the floor now to Eduardo, who will moderate the Q&A. But again, Margarita, it's been an honor and a privilege to be discussing about your book here.
Thank you. Thank you for being my first reader.
Well, thank you very much, Andres and Margarita. I think we have heard a wonderful conversation, and plenty there to discuss. So